Good morning. Well, I do research, as Leo described, on the teachers and the teaching occupation, elementary, secondary teachers in this country. And for the last few years have been looking at this whole issue that we hear a great deal about, the minority teacher shortage. And I use national data. And Leo wanted me to introduce this session by presenting a portrait. Where do we stand on these issues? What do the best national data available tell us? To kind of provide a little context and backdrop. So, and I should say that my co-author with this, Esther Quintero, is over here, and she's at the Albert Shanker Institute. So, this is not a new issue. For 2 to 3 decades now, it's been on the reform and policy front, this idea that the teaching force doesn't look like America on racial, ethnic grounds, and that the teaching force is primarily and perhaps increasingly white, non-Hispanic, and the population of the country, and hence the student population in our schools, is increasingly more racially, ethnically diverse, and that this gap is a problem. There's a bunch of arguments behind this, that it's good for kids to have role models of teachers that share their own racial ethnic background and understand their background, etc. And there's a bunch of research on this, and there's a whole series of arguments there. But there's a general agreement we have a problem. And so for a number of decades now, there's been a solution, and the solution is to recruit and train more minority teachers. This is not new. I saw a figure somewhere that beginning in the 1990s, Ford Foundation and the Reader's Digest Group put a great deal of funding, $60 million, into various initiatives, all kinds of interesting initiatives to recruit more minority teachers into our schools. So the question is, well, how's it worked? Where do we stand now? What do the data tell us? And that's what I'm going to spend a few minutes going through. And I should just say that it's something of a good news, bad news story. And there's kind of some mixed findings here. So first, a word on my data, just a very quick word. I'm using a very large national database on teachers collected by the U.S. Department of Education and the Census Bureau. It's called the Schools and Staffing Survey. And this has been done over 2.5 decades, which is important because I'm able to kind of look over time and see what the situation is. First, let's look at a little data on the gap itself. So, in other words, what's the comparison of the percentage of students who are minority and the percentage of teachers are minority? And this is from the 11-12 school year, so they're several years old, but it's the most recent data I've been able to work with. So at the top there, the blue bar tells us that almost 83% of the teachers in the country, all the elementary, secondary teachers, are white, non-Hispanic, whereas the students are around 56%. So we have a gap there. There's more white, non-Hispanic teachers and students. And then minority, we can see that 44% of the students in the country are minority, only 17% of the teachers are minority. So we see there is a gap. The gap remains. It's still true. It hasn't gone away. And then I've broken down major minority subgroups underneath, and you can see in each case there's more students of that particular racial ethnic subgroup than there are teachers. All the way down to multiple races. And this is all self-report data. This is how people identify themselves in their own background. Okay, so we have a gap. But there's also a good news part here in that we've had a huge increase over time. We still have a gap, but we have a huge increase, something of an unheralded victory here, I think. So the top couple bars tells us that over the last 25 years, late 80s up to 2012, the teaching force grew much faster in this country than the student population. Now that's a whole nother story itself, that the teaching force is outgrowing our student population in this country, and that's a big project I've been working on here. At over twice the rate, 46% increase in teachers during this period, 19% increase in students. But the second lower two bars break this down by race, ethnicity. And what we see is there's actually been a decrease in white non-Hispanic students during this 25-year period, but there's been a 38% increase in white non-Hispanic teachers. The bottom bar is sort of the good news story. The blue bar is longer than the yellow bar. In other words, there's been the increase in minority teachers in our schools has outstripped the increase in minority students. No, we don't have parity, as the prior slide showed, but there's been a very big increase here. So maybe all those recruitment initiatives, something like 2/3 of the states have minority teacher fellowships, recruitment initiatives, maybe they're paying off. There's been a big increase here. It's gone from something like 325,000 minority teachers in the late 80s to now 670,000 minority teachers. This is not small potatoes. Furthermore, the data tell us that minority teachers are disproportionately employed in these hard-to-staff schools. And that was often part of the agenda. Let's recruit minority teachers into these schools that have disproportionate numbers of minority students. And indeed, that's what's done. So of the minority teaching force now, 2/3 are in high poverty schools, 2/3 are in urban schools, 2/3 are in high minority schools. So there's been some victory there, but there's a huge but. There's a huge but going on, which I'm going to try to show in the next slide. Actually, let me back up a little. Here's a slide that breaks down the changes by the minority subgroups. And so you can see that second bar there, minority teachers as a whole have outstripped minority students, but in each group, the teachers have also outstripped, particularly Hispanic there, a 271% increase in Hispanic teachers. I don't know if I can read that, 186% in Hispanic students. Native American is an opposite story. The numbers of Native American teachers have actually decreased during this 25-year period, although we should note that Native Americans it's less, I think it's something like 0.5% of the students in the country, 0.5%. But so in each case, there's been this unheralded victory, except for Native American, where the minority teachers are outgrowing the minority students. That's the good news story. But let me go back to my big but here. And this is the bad news part. This increase in minority teachers in this country, over 100% increase, is all the more remarkable because during this same period, minority teachers have significantly higher turnover rates, quit rates, than do non-minority teachers. So here we have a series of different years where it's the annual public school teacher turnover, people leaving their buildings for whatever reasons, from retirement all the way to they want to quit teaching altogether, to they want to move to another school, etc. And in most cases, the blue bar is longer than the orange bar. Not always, but in most cases. And those are significant, statistically significant differences. That is that minority teachers quit at higher rates, leave their buildings at higher rates than do non-minority teachers. Why is this? What's going on there? We've had this huge victory, we haven't achieved parity, huge victory in recruiting minority teachers, but they're quitting at higher rates. Why could this be? Well, we have what's called some self-report data, where in this national database, these teachers who left or moved are asked why, and here I've broken it down into subcategories. Schools and staff, school staffing actions, that's where your school closed, you were laid off, it's an involuntary transfer, something like that. Family or personal, that's where, well, I moved from or left my job because my spouse moved to another state, I had health issues, I wanted to raise young children, I wanted to care for elderly folks. That's part of life. That happens in every occupation and organization. The last two are the interesting bars to me. I moved or left, and these are minority teachers' reports, because I wanted to pursue another job, a better career, a better job. And the last one, the longest bar, is I was unhappy, I was very dissatisfied. If I add up those two last bars, that accounts for well over half of the large flows of minority teachers out of schools. That's very striking. So, okay, what's behind that dissatisfaction? That's a very vague thing. I mean, just what are these minority teachers that leave their schools who tell us they're dissatisfied, just what are they dissatisfied with? And this takes us to our last slide here, where it's percentages of minority teachers who had left their buildings tell us their degree of dissatisfaction with various issues. And this is 9 or 10 or something. These are the highest ones. There was other ones, most striking. Dissatisfied with administration. So that's over 80%. Dissatisfied with accountability and testing, 65%. Student discipline problems, 61%. Lack of influence and autonomy, 57%. Poor workplace conditions, that's things like chalk, photocopying, supplies, classrooms. Those are sort of physical things. Now, what's interesting about a lot of those ones that are at the top is they don't necessarily cost money. Notice that salaries is less than 40%. Indicate that bad salaries was one of the main reasons, or a main reason why they left. So in other words, a lot of these things are what we call policy amenable. Ostensibly, you could fix them. It's not that they're easy, but they might not even cost money. It's the way these schools are run. It's the management, dissatisfied administration, accountability and testing, student discipline problems, lack of influence and autonomy. So what do the data tell us? That if you could fix those kinds of things, you could slow down the high rates of minority teacher turnover. You could so much faster close the parity gap. That is, that there's the percentage of minority students is larger than the percentage of minority teachers. So, for instance, we did some advanced statistical analyses to try to look at what are the strongest things correlating with the likelihood of minority teachers turning over. And what's interesting was, in the statistical analyses, that middle one, lack of influence and autonomy, was the strongest one. And this is particularly strong in poor urban schools, which are often now highly top-down, high centralized, standardized curriculum, micromanagement, not always, highly scripted curriculum. In other words, taking away the degrees of freedom of these teachers. And it turns out this is the biggest gripe. In fact, if we control for that, and this is getting into the statistical weeds a little bit, it accounts for the higher rates of minority teacher turnover. In other words, the statistics tell us that if you could fix those things about those schools, minority teachers would not be turning over any faster than non-minority teachers. That's what the statistics tell us. So let me just wrap up and go back here. There's a great deal of, and wrap this thing up, there's a great deal of concern in this country that we have a minority teacher shortage, that the teaching force does not look like America. And we've had dozens of, and spent millions of dollars on interesting recruitment efforts over the last couple decades. And indeed, they have worked. The numbers of minority teachers has gone up faster than the numbers of minority students. It's gone up almost 2.5 times the rate of non-minority teachers. But there's a huge but, that these teachers are more likely to be in these hard-to-staff schools, which unfortunately often have less than the best working conditions, and so hence these teachers quit at higher rates. It's almost like I don't think tragedy is the word. We're bringing in people and then they're quitting at higher rates. We're sort of bringing them in and then our job's over. We recruited them. If we could just work a little more on the retention end. Recruitment alone won't solve the problem if large numbers of those recruit then leave within a few years. We need to have recruitment and retention. And indeed, right now, Esther and I are working on a project looking at all the initiatives out there, design, state initiatives, local initiatives, foundation initiatives, to look at increasing the representation of minorities in teaching in this country. Which ones focus on both recruitment and retention? The vast majority, it turns out, only focus on recruitment. They bring in people, they give them fellowships, and then the job's done. But we have found something like 12 or 15 programs, we're going to write these up, in the country, a growing genre that do both. And the data tell us that's where the hope lies. That's what we need to do to fix this problem. So that's it for my 15 minutes. Thank you very much.